Good morning.
Okay, good morning. How's that sounding?
That sounds great.
Oh, great. Good. David, right?
Yes, yes. And
Yeah, nice to meet you.
likewise.
Yeah.
I wish we could do this in
David,
person.
yeah. So real quick intros. What do you do? I'm not familiar with your
No,
background.
I'm a relative newcomer to the Waterbird Society. So I'm at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, primarily a trophic ecologist, coming mostly from a marine and estuarine fish background. But we've been doing trophodynamics of coastal seabirds now for the past 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, that's excellent. Boy, sounds
Coming
like you'd be a great. I'd love to talk to you about menhaden sometime.
Well, growing up in the Chesapeake, we always talked about him as bunker, but happy to do so anytime.
So I lead National Audubon's seabird field programs in Maine, and we're used to thinking of them as pogies.
Right.
Yeah. Well, great. Yeah, I have a fun lifestyle. I bounce back and forth between Maine in the summer, leading field programs there. And then I have an academic appointment at Oregon State.
Okay.
And so I'm there in Oregon now, and spend winters, kind of the academic year there. So
that is quite a remote field site from Oregon.
But a nice one.
Yeah,
No complaints. Yeah. So I guess before we start letting folks in, with Danielle and I, we'd set it up so that I would kind of MC, and she was going to be the tech person. How should you and I split that up?
However you wish. So this is my first time. Well, I participated as a watcher for last year's virtual meeting, but I didn't do any sort of moderating. So I'm happy to do whatever you would like me to do. If it's just monitoring the chat for questions, I can chat with the presenters coming up to make sure that they're ready. What would be the best way that I can help you?
I'm completely flexible. I think if you'd like to get some visibility for yourself, I'm happy for you to be the MC. But I'm also happy to do that. I'm flexible.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not so worried about my own visibility. That's the nice thing about being a mid-level faculty member.
Yeah,
I'm not a hungry postdoc trying to make a name for myself. So in particular, because I don't know many of these researchers, I don't know if you know them well.
I know several of our speakers reasonably well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in that case, if you're amenable to it, I'll have you do the MC lead, and I'll monitor the chat and make sure everybody's ready.
Okay. Why don't we have you grab the host from me, just so you have full control over things. This is the second session I've been involved in moderating, and what worked well in the first one was making all of the speakers co-hosts.
Okay.
That way, that no trouble sharing their slides.
Okay.
And then I see we have people in the waiting room.
Yeah.
Three of the speakers are already in the waiting room, so we could admit them.
So yeah, I can admit people into the room, so I can also monitor that.
Great.
So are you ready for them at this point?
Yeah, I think so. It'd be great for us to give everybody a chance to share their screen, make sure they're sharing the presentation mode of PowerPoint, and yeah.
Perfect. All right, let them in.
Yeah.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So just introductions. My name's Don Lyons, and David Kerstetter and I are the moderators. And we've just divvied up roles. I'll do the introductions, and David will lead our tech. And it would be great for everyone, all the speakers, to one by one share slides, I think, before we start the session, just to make sure everybody's connected and we have the right permissions in place for everybody to go for it. So maybe, Allison, you're showing up first on my screen, so maybe we could start with you.
Says host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay. David, are you seeing how to make people co-host?
Yes.
Yeah.
There, you should be able to do it now.
Got it.
Looks great.
All right.
So I'm seeing presentation mode. So I'm actually seeing both the slide and the next slide.
I will change that 1 second.
That looks great. That's full screen slide. Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
I talk now and it changing.
Yes, we are seeing your slides advance.
Okay. I will stop sharing. Thank you.
Excellent. Amy, you're up next for me.
All right. Can you hear me? All right.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. So let's see here. Right. Okay. How do things look? Can you see?
That looks great. Full screen slide.
Wonderful. All right. And should be overview slide now.
Yep.
Correct.
Wonderful. All right. So let's see. Let me.
Great.
Stop sharing.
Amy, excuse me for not remembering. Is that E in your last name pronounced? Is that?
No, it's just Van Tatenhove.
Great. Thank you.
So now I got to figure out where my Zoom window went. I'm glad we're doing this now.
If you have two screens, mine always pops up on the other screen and you have to like, turn it off on your other screen. That's always my issue.
There we go. Yep.
Perfect.
I'm like, where is it? And it's like hidden over there.
Yep. My file.
All right. Alex, how about you go next?
Hello, can you hear me?
Good morning.
Morning, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, we hear you well.
Oh. Is that in full screen now?
There we go. Perfect. Full screen slide, and you're advancing fine. Looks good.
Cool, thank you.
All right, thank you. Jen, you want to go next?
Sure. I also had a quick question. So my original information said that my talk was at 10:20, but I think, has it been shifted to 10:40? Am I the third talk in the session?
Yeah,
let me-
I saw that I was at 10:20 now.
Okay.
I was supposed to be lightning talk, but then I got put in here, so maybe that's what happened. I don't know how it happened, but I was like, all
Okay,
right.
it doesn't matter. I just want to make sure I'm ready at the right time.
Yeah, so I'm going off, or I will go off the Drifta schedule, which has Jen at 10:40. Yeah.
And
I just refreshed to check to see if they changed it somehow behind the scenes, but it's still showing you, Jen, at 10:40.
okay, perfect. And here's my slides. Seems to be working. And are you seeing full screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. And also, sorry to be difficult, I wanted to give you guys a heads up that my talk is running 17, 18 minutes. I will be done within my 20 minutes, but I just wanted to let you know that so you're not getting nervous. So.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's nice not having concurrent sessions. We have a little more flexibility than meetings with many sessions, but I'll do my best to help out. I think if we're coming up on a couple minutes before 20, and I'm not sensing that you're close, I'll probably interrupt just to help get us to stay on schedule. But I'll try and do that in a friendly way.
And I understand that that's a little bit my question time, but I that's as far as I could cut it down. So
I'm in the same boat, so don't worry.
Right. Yeah, I'll be here with the stopwatch, so we'll try to keep you in line.
Just start pinging us in the chat, like, stop.
One nice thing about these virtual meetings, though, is that there is the chat, and the Q&A can happen during the next talk if the speaker and audience wants to do that. So I think that's one plus of this format.
Oh, it's a huge bonus. I think it's wonderful that we're doing it in person and people can actually ask you questions like right there instead of having a recorded talk that no one ever watches. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. There is a difference about it being live in terms of interest and ability to attract an audience. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep.
well, the bonus here is that it is also all being recorded. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, right? So if you do miss something because of a time change or whatever, you can go back and watch it eventually. So yeah.
Great. David, I don't see anyone else and any of the other speakers out in the waiting room. So I guess we'll see if David shows up, and let's see, who else are we missing? Hillary, I guess. I think David's done this enough this week. He's probably good to go. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Jen, while we're on the line, I'm not sure I have a link for your class for this afternoon.
Did I not send you a link yet? Okay, I'll send it.
It's possible you did.
So long ago. I will send you a link after this session is over, so you have it. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. No rush. But and you may have sent it before, and I just lost track of it.
I think we talked about it so long ago, and then I was waiting to make sure you were still able to do it. So I'm pretty sure I did. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's see. I actually have a background slide we could use or not for when the session starts. You guys seeing that slide?
Looks good.
Yeah. Can leave that up, and then if one of the other speakers shows up and we have a chance to practice, we can take it back down. But
I'll be right back.
Amy, I have to say I'm impressed with your cat training skills. From what I've seen on Twitter, you know what you're doing.
Well, I have a very good pupil. She does pretty well, so she's very motivated.
Uh,
My older cat won't do anything, so but she
yeah.
own cat, so keeps
I
me.
do a little bit of dog training, and they seem infinitely easier than cats.
Yes, well, sometimes depends on how hungry the cats are. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, so I got this cat during the pandemic, and sitting at home, I'm so bored. I'm like, well, I can teach her tricks, and it's worked well so far.
Mm. Yeah. No, it's fun. Time well spent.
Yeah, thanks. Makes for good Twitter likes. So.
Right.
Got some more people that just joined the meeting.
Well, I have this right at the top of the hour, but I think we don't have too many folks in the room yet, so we'll hold off at least a couple minutes to wait for more people to join.
Yeah, we're getting a few at a time. I think everybody is slowly getting caffeinated. And Abby commented that the other session was running a little late, so we'll get a couple stragglers from there too.
Mm. while we're waiting for critical mass here, I'd like to point people towards the conference merchandise sales area, as well as the quilt raffle. The raffle tickets are only $5, and the proceeds go to student travel to that next meeting that happens in person, which will hopefully be the next meeting a year from now in Texas. There's also a couple of events this afternoon that we hope everyone will join. The business meeting and committee meetings time slot is a great chance to get more familiar with the society, how it's governed, and some of the focal areas, some of the committees that various members in the organization are working on. And then finally, the award ceremony, including a presentation by a Best Paper Award winner from the journal. So definitely, there's still a very full schedule this afternoon after kind of the scientific presentations are complete. And I hope you guys will all consider joining. And I think there'll be opportunities for a little more interaction and maybe even some socializing, which is always good. David, what do you think about the rate of people entering? Should we perhaps move forward? Oh, David, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's like the last couple kernels in the microwave popcorn. You get a couple stragglers at the very end. But I think we should go ahead and get started, especially if people's presentations are at the limit anyway.
Yeah. Okay, great. Welcome everyone to this session. We're focused on conservation, habitat, and restoration this morning. We have a solid 2 hours of presentations with a bunch of wonderful speakers. And to start us off, we have Alex Nicole Harper, who's going to be talking about eiders and demographic measures, and I think contributing some really neat data synthesis that is not generally done for most species. So Alex, please take it away.
Thank you, Don, for that really nice introduction. I cannot share my screen while you're sharing, apparently.
Oh, there we go. I think I'm out of the way now.
Yes, there we go. Okay. There we go. Are we seeing full screen?
Yes, looks good.
Thank you. So I'm Alex, and as Don's nicely introduced, I'll be talking about a data synthesis that we've done for vital rates in the common eider. This is basically the first chapter of my PhD. I'm in my final year at the University of Southampton in the UK in collaboration with the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, who are also a UK-based NGO. So my supervisory team are Professors Tom Ezard and Patrick Doncaster at the University of Southampton, and then Jeff Hilton and Kevin Wood at WJBT. And then this work is also in collaboration with Tony Diamond and Heather Major from the Atlantic Laboratory for Avian Research in New Brunswick, Canada, Ivar Peterson of Iceland, and Grigory Tertitsky from the Russian Academy of Sciences. I'm going to start off with my acknowledgements. So the work was funded by a doctoral training program award from the Natural Environment Research Council. The portion of the work relating to Macchia Seal Island was funded by Environment and Climate Change Canada, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and the Sir James Dunn Wildlife Research Fund. And we also thank the BOU for a member travel award for this work in 2019, and then thanks to my supervisory team. So why sea ducks? Why care about sea ducks? Why be interested in their vital rates? As a tribe, they are sort of generally of conservation concerns. You can see, for example, the Steller's eider is decreasing and vulnerable on the red list, and there's actually substantial uncertainty for many of the species trends forecasts, below 2 examples with unknown trends. And Juliet spoke a little bit about this earlier in the conference because they're They tend to be sort of remote species out at sea where it's difficult to monitor them. And perhaps surprisingly, even the best studied, the common eider, so there's quite a lot of data for this species, has an unknown global population trend. So why does the common eider have so much data available despite this uncertainty? Well, their vital rates, and so here we're talking about things like survival and fertility, have been recorded by various parties for different reasons. So scientists are interested in various aspects. So for example, they have quite an extreme breeding biology. So the females basically get no help from the males. They constantly incubate for about a month pretty much, and without eating, so they lose up to half their body weight. There's anthropogenic mortality factors that might be considered, and also environmental drivers, so things like ice in the northern parts of their range. They're also farmed for eider down, especially in Iceland, and so this means that they're being really closely observed during breeding and perhaps also benefiting from things like predator control. And they're also hunted for subsistence and sport in various parts of the range, which you can see in the bottom right. So the abundance of data that's out there motivated our data synthesis for their demographic parameters. And we hope that also this could help inform things for the other seaducks where they're less studied. This could be kind of a reference standard. So why do we care about demography? Population dynamics, beyond being sort of central part of ecology, we can use demographic parameters to inform population models, which can in turn inform management. So for example, some of these models can tell us which life stages population growth rate is most sensitive to. And so you could then use that to prioritize interventions. So whether it's most important to protect nests or to reduce mortality on adults, for example. And it might be surprising that actually high quality demographic data is available for very few bird species. So this is a study by Kunde and colleagues, and they found for the birds in their study that there was a complete lack of data for more than a third of species, and what they deemed high quality, so age-specific mortality and fertility, for only 2.4%, one of these species being the common eider. And so we want to make the best of that data that's already out there. In terms of which vital rates we're interested in our subsequent work, so the rest of my PhD, we use the vital rates to parameterize matrix population models, which particularly explore the demographic consequences of different breeding assumptions, particularly around intermittent breeding. And so that kind of organize which vital rates we were collecting, but pretty much we cover the key ones. So we collated estimates for survival across the first year, the second year, and then annually for 3-year-olds upwards. Recruitment, both in terms of age-specific breeding probability and breeding propensity across potential recruitment ages. I'll talk a little bit later about the differences between those. Breeding propensity of the established female breeders, so how likely they are to breed each year once they've recruited. And for reproduction, we've got clutch size, hatch success, which is the probability of successfully hatching eggs, and then per egg, and then fledging success, which is surviving from hatch to fledging. So we put out a call for data via the IUCN's Species Survival Commission Duck Specialist Group. The link is there if you're interested. And through this, we had more than 20 responses from over, I think, from 8 countries, which is pretty much the range of the species. There were lots of really interesting contributions, sort of discussions, but we were particularly interested and particularly relevant here is that we got 3 previously inaccessible data sets on clutch size. So we had one from Iceland, which is actually published online as a report, but it's in Icelandic. And so this would have been inaccessible to me searching and to a lot of non-Icelandic researchers. Then we have an unpublished data set from the Solovetsky archipelago in Russia from Grigori. And then a sort of set of unpublished bits of data from Machiasil Island from Heather and Tony, and they would like to thank the field technicians who were involved in collecting those. And we would like to thank all the participants, all the respondents, and the Duck Specialist Group, particularly Rich Hearn of the WWG, who sort of facilitated this. Furthermore, I did a lot of searching of the scientific and grey literature, citation snowballing, which is where you're following sort of citation chains through the literature. And also we then cross-reference what I'd found with IVAR's personal reference library. And so that showed that hopefully a good core data set. And we found over 100 studies, in fact, over 120, quantifying at least one vital rate, many quantifying more than one. So the actual data set is now available on Dryad. And then I've just got on the right showing what the actual files within that are. So the whole thing is a relational database, which means you've got a master sheet, which in this case has the study level information. And I'll show you that in a second. And then you have the subsheets, one for each vital rate, and these are linked by a unique identifier. These can be seen in, maybe the simplest is in an Excel book, so you've got all the sheets in one, but it's also available each sheet separately as a CSV, which is non-proprietary, and also is what you might tend to read in something like R if you wanted to do some further data handling. We've also got a text file near the bottom, which is a translation to English of the summary of the Icelandic dataset contributed by Ivar, which is provided, and also a README, which describes the metadata. So I'm aware this is very small, but it's just kind of to remind me to tell you the bits that are in there. So the master sheet, we've got the unique identifier for the study, and these are numbered for sort of regular studies, ending in 127, which is the Icelandic contributed study. Then we have A and B for the unpublished data sets which contributed, and then we also have some combinations, which is where they've stated in the paper, for example, clutch size was found to be 4.5 across this set of studies. We then have publication year, any further identification needed, URLs, countries, more specific location data, subspecies if it was either provided or we could tell from the location which subspecies it was referring to, lambda trends, that's the population growth rate, so that's if there was either a value or a sort of qualitative statement that, for example, this colony was increasing during the time they were measuring the vital rates. Whether the study is verified, and so that means we either saw it sort of in the flesh or it was a quotation of a different study which we were not able to access, and we give the link for that, and comments. An example of a subsheet, this is the top of the clutch size subsheet. It has the ID on the left, which is how you'd link it back to the study level information. We have the estimate of the clutch size. We have some estimates, both provided and potentially calculated for variability. And so that's if either they've stated, for example, that the standard error was such and such, or I was able to calculate one of these numbers from things that are provided in the study. Sample size, start and end years, covariates. So here for the ID1, they provided the clutch sizes that we've used are those based on all nests, but they've also provided values just for completed nests specifically where they could confirm that. Comments, then we have some columns for filtering. So first refers to if you might want to remove studies where the value is a midpoint based on a range. So for example, sometimes in the text it says something like clutch size was from 4 to 6, and you could perhaps then kind of infer a mean of 5, but that would depend on the distribution. So if you're being conservative, you can filter those sort of estimates out. We also have an independence column. So that's where there might be multiple estimates per study, and you only want to take one to avoid pseudo replication. And in that column, we've got some M's, which is where, for example, study 1 has an estimate for each year, and you might want to do some form of meta-analysis or simply a weighted mean or just a mean to take one number forward from that. And then we have some overwrite columns, which is where if we've provided, say, a lambda trend for the whole study, or there wasn't one for the whole study, perhaps because it was across different locations, you could sort of overwrite for each estimate their specific location or lambda trend, for example. And a couple of sort of special cases to highlight. So this actually came up during review, so we're thankful to the reviewers on the paper, which I'll talk about in a second for this. But basically, some people measure the survival in the first year from fledging, which is kind of what we imagined, which is why we'd measured collected fledging success. But some people measure it from hatch, and so then you need to kind of take into account when you're making a life cycle model from it. And then this was the different types of sort of recruitment data that I mentioned. So on the top, we've got probability of first breeding. And this is if you took all the recruits, what age did they recruit at? And so, for example, you can see study 3 has ages 2, 3, 4, and 5, as these are all the ages that eiders are thought to potentially recruit at. So 1 is too young, and then by 5 they should have recruited. And these would sum to 1, because of all the individuals that recruit, when did they recruit? Whereas other studies, they just measure simply breeding propensity at an age. And so here for study 16, it's 0 at 1 because they're too young. It's 1 at 5, assuming constant breeding. And then it's the values. Say you have a almost half chance of breeding at 3, and that's regardless of whether you bred at 2 or not. And we sort of, you can combine those with some mathematics. This will soon be available as a data paper. It's in press at Ecological Solutions and Evidence, and we thank Morton, Svein, and one other anonymous reviewer for their help with this. And just some sort of results, I guess. This is the distribution of the vital rates that we found. So you can see the clutch size is by far the most commonly estimated value. Adult survival is quite well estimated. hatch success as well, and then not really that many estimates for the early life survival and recruitment or breeding propensity. Some of the sort of reasoning behind this, we think clutch size, not to underestimate fieldwork, but of all the vital rates, clutch size is probably the easiest to record. So common eiders are colonial in nesting, they're site faithful, the females are very constant incubators and amenable to observation, even in some cases being picked off the nest by hand. So then it's just a case of counting the eggs, not some sort of longitudinal study. Whereas in comparison, breeding propensity and also adult survival require longitudinal studies to measure. Particularly with breeding propensity, we think it might be underestimated in terms of the number of studies, because it's often assumed to be one by default, that once you've recruited, you'll just breed every year. But this doesn't seem to be the case. From the studies we found, there was a mean of 0.72 across 6 studies, ranging from as low as 0.5 in Nunavut to as high as 0.92 for the dressage subspecies. And I do have a slide on this that I've sort of saved for later if anyone's particularly interested. Some caveats: it wasn't a fully systematic study, although hopefully the kind of comparison of mine and Ivar's data sets helps to ensure that we've got all the core studies. It's worth noting that some studies are not included because they provide the vital rate estimates in figures. So like in the bottom right, that's an example of clutch size being plotted. And so you could use something like data thief, or I guess just a ruler and very carefully trying to work out the numbers. But we decided it'd be sort of simpler, more conservative not to do that. And also some studies use the vital rates but only use covariates. So for example, regressing them against an environmental variable. And if there wasn't a mean to pull out, then we didn't use those. So finally, some data gaps that we found. There was not very many estimates of juvenile or male survival compared to female. It's not too big an issue because females are usually the limiting sex in seaducks, and so you would be making female-based models generally, but it could be useful to have male and female to compare something like vulnerability to hunting, for example. There weren't very many estimates of population change, even qualitative, and that might be something quite useful to include without much effort, because I'm sure most studies you'd have kind of an idea of what's happening on the colony during the time you were measuring things. And also Russia, given its size and eiders up there are not very many estimates, at least accessible in English. So to conclude, given that such sort of syntheses of life history data are reported unavailable for most species, we hope this database is useful for modelers and managers in that it provides sort of a one-stop shop rather than having to go through the literature like I did. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop there.
Alex, thanks so much. We have time for a couple questions, if we have them. And folks, you could submit those in the chat and we could read them there. Or if you'd like to raise your hand, I could, using the Zoom raise your hand function, I'll see that and could call on you to unmute yourself. So questions for Alex? I guess one question I was, and I may have just missed this, Alex, but I'm wondering, what's the easiest way for people to access these data that want to use them in modeling exercises or for other purposes?
So currently the data set's already on Dryad. So if you just go to Dryad and search my name and eider, to come up, I have got the DOI, I can share that in the chat. And then it would be, you can download it. I think it all downloads as a zip file. The Excel spreadsheet, the Excel SX, whatever the extension is, that's the easiest to sort of browse because it's got all of the sheets in one, and it's also got little comment boxes on each of the columns, which kind of explains more about what is in that column. But personally, when I sort of do all the data handling for this in R, and so then we read them in, the CSV files are kind of easier and more stable for reading in if you want to, do further analyses on this kind of stuff.
I see we have a question from Juliet. I'll just read it. This is a huge effort, Alex. What do you recommend for people who might be interested in compiling similar range-wide data sets for other species? Any suggestions or lessons learned to help other folks?
Thank you, Juliet. Yeah. I guess, given the amount of effort that went into it, if you're planning from the start, you probably could set it up to be systematic. So mine was sort of, I was starting my PhD, I was doing lit review, I was kind of collecting them as I went along. And then it almost seemed like too much effort to go back and start the whole search process again. Whereas I guess if you know at the beginning, this is what you're doing, I think it'd be a lot easier to set it up as a systematic thing and, have your defined search terms and then be able to rerun it over time, things like that.
Oh, that's great. I think we'll move on at this point to kind of keep close to schedule. Our next talk is by Alison Kosek, and it's kind of an exciting conservation story about piping plovers in North America and recolonization of some of their historic breeding range. So Alison, your slides look great. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Don. So yes, I just first want to say thank you so much to all of my great collaborators and my advisor for allowing me to work on this project. It's been really exciting. So for those of you who may not know about piping plovers, they are this adorable sandy colored shorebird that are found to live and breed on sandy beaches throughout the United States and Canada. There are 3 distinct breeding populations of these birds, and the smallest population is in the center here, the Great Lakes population, and that's the focus of this talk today. Historically, piping plovers are estimated to have been found in numbers between 500 and 700 pairs, and it's believed that about 50% of that population were found in the eastern 2 Great Lakes of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, but these birds were found at one time throughout all of the Great Lakes, and they were a common sight on beaches within the Great Lakes. Unfortunately, by the 1980s, we had lost a large portion of this population, and it had shrunk to only persisting within Michigan itself. And so the Eastern Great Lakes had been completely extirpated of piping plovers. This loss, of course, occurred primarily due to habitat loss from shoreline development, as well as from water management stabilizing strategies to keep lake water levels very level. It also started early in the century due to market hunting, where these birds were hunted for food. And then later, disturbance from recreators on the beach was a huge problem for these birds. People pretty much trashed the beaches, drove all over them, and had really no concern for the wildlife that lived there. And this also increased predation rates on nests as commensal predators entered the area as more people were around. However, in 1986, these birds were listed in the United States as federally endangered. And so a recovery effort was made to protect these birds, both in Canada and the United States. Some of the recovery efforts included placing exclosures on nests to prevent nests from being depredated by predators, as well as captive rearing eggs and chicks that were abandoned on the ground. And with these 2 efforts, as well as people being just out there and protecting these birds, this population has begun to recover to the point where it's around 70 pairs today. And that's really exciting, but we still have a ways to go because the recovery plan is to get these birds up to over 150 pairs. In New York itself, it was estimated that in the 1930s, we had around 27 pairs of piping plovers, and these birds were mostly nesting on the far eastern shore of Lake Ontario in these 4 sandy beach strips that you can see colored in red, orange, blue, and green. And these birds were spread out throughout this area, and they predominantly were found around barrier outlets where water can flow in between Lake Ontario and back marshes. And these areas, of course, produce very large sand flats that these birds prefer for nesting. The birds are mostly extinct in New York as of 1960s. However, there was one final known nesting attempt in 1984 that was unsuccessful. And as I mentioned, people had really torn up these beaches due to recreation. And around the 1980s, the same time as the birds were listed, a lot of land managers decided that they really wanted to work hard to recover this habitat. And so they became a huge push to protect the dunes and to restore the barrier dune system. And this restoration seems to have paid off because plovers then returned about 30 years later in 2015 to New York. This was the first site in the Eastern Great Lakes to get plovers nesting again. And it was really great to have them back. They nested at Lakeview Wildlife Management Area in the orange. They again returned in 2016, and a second pair also showed up at Sandy Island Beach State Park. However, in 2017, high water levels flooded all of these beaches and took away pretty much all of the habitat available for these birds. So no birds nested in 2017. And following that high water event, only a single pair returned to the area to nest at Sandy Island Beach State Park for the next few years. And so now that you know a little background about the Great Lakes plovers and those in New York, my objectives for this talk are to describe the ecology of this newly recolonized population in New York, to describe the best practices that we found for maintaining and growing the population, and then to quickly describe the 2021 season and determine whether these birds in New York are contributing successfully to the species recovery. And so we'll quickly start out describing the ecology of these birds by we performed a GIS analysis on landscape scale habitat factors that are at nest sites, known nest sites in Michigan, where the core population of these birds persists, and comparing those habitat characteristics to those in New York, where these birds, we believe, historically used beaches. And so I'm going to quickly highlight the differences between these two sites, Michigan being the site that we want to strive to be like here in New York. So in Michigan, their beaches tend to be predominantly very wide, over 90 feet wide, whereas in New York, we have a large amount of our beaches, almost a third of them being incredibly narrow. And so that can be a huge concern because these birds do like the wider beaches because it provides better nesting habitat and more foraging opportunities. We also found that in Michigan, most of the substrate on these beaches is sand, as you would expect for a beach. However, in New York, about a quarter of our beach habitat has been converted to artificial structures, such as this riprap you can see here. People are placing these rocks on the shoreline to help protect their homes from flood damage, but that's causing a loss of habitat for these birds, as well as changing the movement of sand on these beaches. We also found that in Michigan, most of the land there is protected parkland, whereas in New York, a vast majority is private land, which is, of course, makes it very difficult for conservation to really work its magic on these private small properties. It's hard to get the support to do it on small properties, and it's hard to do it in a very direct way. And finally, we found that in Michigan, the majority of the vegetation around these beaches is low density shrubs and trees. And that differs from New York, which has primarily moderate and high density shrubs and trees, as well as manicured lawns from those residential properties. And this is a big problem because succession has clearly been taking place here in New York, and it hasn't been pushed back at all by disturbances such as storms. And so this is obviously not optimal for a species that requires this early successional beach habitat with very low density shrubs. And so, as well as doing an analysis comparing our habitat to Michigan, we also wanted to do some on the ground work with the birds that we actually have. And so we performed behavioral and habitat surveys in 2018 and 2019 on the single pair that we had on our beach. So all of this, of course, take with a grain of salt. We only had one pair to work with, so that is what we have here. So this first figure is basically showing the habitat use by adults and hatch year birds on the left compared to what habitat was available on the ground. And we found that for both adults and hatchier birds, they're using habitat out of proportion to what's available. But for adults, they're using rack more predominantly than what's available, whereas hatchier birds are using that sandy upper beach that isn't very wet out of proportion to what's available. And so this is a little concerning for the hatchier birds because the rack area tends to be the best habitat for foraging. And so these birds may be being prevented from using this habitat by disturbance or something else is going on. And this is something that we'll continue to look at and figure out if it's impacting their survival. Also looking quickly at behavior of these birds, we looked at behavior of adult and hatchier birds in both 2018 and 2019. And here you can see foraging in the light blue, resting and preening behaviors in the dark blue, disturbed behaviors in the green, and other behaviors in the dark green. And you can see that birds are predominantly foraging as during our surveys, which is not surprising. Of course, they need to do that a lot to keep their energy and to survive. However, the other good thing is that we're finding that disturbance in the light green is fairly low. However, my concern with this is that most of our surveys during this time were performed midweek earlier in the morning when there weren't as many people present. And so future efforts will be targeted to get a better, well-rounded view of when, of throughout the week when people will probably be more actively on this beach and potentially causing more disturbance during weekends, holidays, later in the day, things like that, so that we can get a better, clearer picture of what's actually impacting these birds. And now that I've described the ecology of the birds in New York, I'll quickly describe our practices for maintaining and hopefully growing the population. The first thing we did was create a working group. We have a number of both state, federal, university, and NGO agencies working together to protect these birds. And although we have very few pairs, it's important to have a lot of people joining together because these beaches are incredibly remote and require either boating or walking several miles to get out there. So you need a lot of support to protect these birds. And of course, we do most of the things that everyone else has been doing throughout the Great Lakes and the Atlantic coast to protect piping plovers, detecting and removing predators as we can to prevent predation on nests, chicks, and adults. Having on the ground education events, having actually state park staff out there talking to people on the ground and getting people invested in these birds and caring about these birds rather than being upset about the fact that these birds do take up a small portion of their beach. Also, we place predator exposures on nests to help prevent predation of eggs. And we encourage law enforcement to be out on the beaches to increase compliance of rules that are put in place to help protect these birds. Without law enforcement out there on occasion, no one really feels the need to follow the rules. So that is a very critical component. And then of course, our advocacy component as well is mainly being performed by those NGOs, by getting out the word about the plovers to the wider public, as well as taking on any issues that develop on the ground. Most recently, we had an issue where dredging was occurring while the birds were first coming back in the spring and looking for nest sites, which is not an optimal combination. And the dredging had to be shut down. And of course, that led to some anger with local homeowners. And so through advocacy, we're able to somewhat ameliorate those issues and bring this issue to the larger public to get a positive view of the situation. And finally, we also have, once we determined that perhaps New York has some subpar habitat in many ways as compared to New York, we realized we needed to do some restoration work to increase the value of this habitat for nesting birds. And so at Lakeview Wildlife Management Area, where the birds initially recolonized New York, but then were not found following 2016, we actually chose an area where the birds had attempted nesting, and we removed some of the larger vegetation in that area to set back succession there. And then we removed a scarp that had been created and leveled out the beach a little bit more so that if a nest were to be placed, the chicks could get from the upper beach down to the lower beach. And we also added shelly substrate to 2 locations here at Lakeview Wildlife Management Area because these birds are known to like to place small shells within their nest cups. And now I'm going to quickly describe the 2021 season, what the outcomes were from that restoration project, and how our birds might be contributing to the larger population. So we were really excited because birds hadn't been at Lakeview in several years, and immediately following our restoration work, we had a pair of birds show up. These birds began scraping in both of our restoration sites, and they did actually place a nest on the ground. Unfortunately, it was predated at 1 egg and the pair split up. So we do plan in the future to do more predator management at this site, as well as hopefully place exclosures on nests earlier in the breeding cycle. It's been pretty successful in the Great Lakes that they've placed exclosures on nests before a nest is fully clutched. And so we plan to do that at this site in the future. After that pair split, the male left the area and the female moved down to Sandy Island Beach State Park, where we ended up having 2 nesting pairs this year. And both of these pairs successfully hatched chicks. However, we only were able to get 2 of those chicks to fledging, but those 2 chicks did come from our nest of new parents to the area. The parents on the left were the same birds that have been in this area since 2018. And while they hatched 3 chicks, all of them were lost, unfortunately. But having 3 nests was really exciting because that's the most we've had in recent times. And also, we actually ended up with a total of 7 birds visiting our site, which was really great. This is the most birds we've ever seen. And 2 of the birds actually that nested this year were new birds that were actually captive reared. So this was a really exciting event, not only for us, but for the Great Lakes population, that some of our captive reared birds are returning to these new sites, which has not been seen in the past. And we also had an additional young female who came to our site that was from Michigan as well. And so we had 5 breeding birds and 2 migrants, including one of our chicks from 2020. And I only bring this up because that bird really it's exciting to see them not only fledging, but coming back and knowing that they survived their first year. And so just to better understand, not only we know that birds are coming our way, but also how are we contributing to the population. This first slide is looking at how the birds, where the birds are coming from that are moving to New York. And you can see that the vast majority have been coming from Wasaga Beach in Ontario, Canada, which is a site near to us. So it's not that surprising that birds from that site might move to New York. However, more recently, we're getting more birds from Michigan, including those 2 captive reared birds that I just spoke about. And so that's great news that we're getting a mix of genetics within the Great Lakes coming to New York to nest. And then as far as birds that we are fledging coming back and breeding, we've had 2 individuals so far return and be observed breeding. We're not 100% sure about that bird on the left that went to Michigan. They weren't able to get a full band combo, but we're pretty sure it was that bird because she then later showed up at our site. So we do know that these birds are coming back. They are attempting to breed. However, this past year was a rough one because we had a skewed sex ratio in the Eastern Great Lakes where there were more female birds, plovers than males. And so unfortunately, both of these individuals ended up being secondary extra pair copulations, females with a male that already had a mate. And so because they didn't have a mate with them that could help them incubate regularly, both of them lost their nests. So with that, we aren't, of course, incredibly certain as to how New York stands with supporting the population, but we do know that we're getting fledglings out there. We have birds moving around. And so hopefully in the future, we'll have some of those birds successfully nesting. If you have any questions, feel free to ask and join our Facebook and Instagram site if you'd like. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Allison. We have time for one quick question, but I'll just mention I saw in the chat there is a very lovely painting, a Piping Plover painting available in the auction site. So definitely go check that out. I see we have one question from Michelle in the chat. Allison, do you think the chicks are less disturbed because they're spending time in the upper beach where people are not located? So it's not an immediate disturbance, but a complete avoidance of the rack line because of human presence?
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of our thoughts right now. We're going to have to look at our behavioral observations from this year, because we did actually find a chick that was deceased in the upper beach area. And we found that it was malnourished, and the birds had seemed to have been keeping the birds way up on the upper beach area, never bringing them down to the shoreline. And so maybe that's why the bird was malnourished. But why are the birds doing that? Is it because of disturbance? What's going on? We're going to have to figure out some new way of looking at this to get at this question and hopefully prevent it from happening again. Thank you, Michelle. I wish I could answer it more thoroughly.
Yeah. And I see Pat Baird has her hand raised. Pat, do you have a quick question?
I just was curious. I thought that these birds were listed, and so why isn't there more protection like fencing and stuff like that that we have on the West Coast in California with least terns?
Yeah, Pat, we actually do have symbolic fencing around areas where the birds are nesting. However, one of the sites that these birds are using is a state park, which is managed for recreation rather than for wildlife. And so it's been a bit of a struggle to manage getting them to, they are doing protections for the birds, but kind of maybe not as many as we would like to see happen. At one time, that entire northern, one of the spits at that beach was completely closed off to the public, and it's been more open over the past 10 years due to land use changes, it converting to a park. So there are definitely protections in place. They are following the direct rules from Fish and Wildlife Service, but it would be great if they did a little bit more. And so we're continuing to push them and hopefully get more done.
Thanks.
Great. Allison, thanks so much for sharing a little bit of good news. Always welcome. But moving on, our next talk is going to focus on kind of an understudied portion of the breeding range of common terns. And Jennifer Arnold will be updating us on surveys and our understanding of the population trajectory for this species. Take it away, Jen.
Can you all hear me okay?
Looks good, and we hear you well. Great.
Okay, perfect. All right, so the title of my presentation today is Understanding Widespread Declines for Common Terns in Inland North America. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, Steve Oswald, Scott Wilson, and Patty Stitch. So common terns are long-lived, piscivorous, ground-nesting, colonial breeding water birds. They have a global distribution indicated here with the breeding distribution in yellow and the wintering distribution in blue. Although today's talk is going to focus on inland breeding populations right here, I wanted to show this global range so that I could mention that the majority of studies that have been done on common terns to understand their breeding behavior and demography have focused on saltwater populations. However, inland populations and freshwater populations constitute a significant part of their range. In recent years, studies of inland terns, comparing inland terns to those in saltwater populations, have indicated that inland populations are uniquely different in many aspects of their demography and ecology, and that the implications for the loss of inland populations would go beyond the aesthetic consequences of losing this beautiful bird in a native part of their range, but also constitute significant loss of genetic diversity for the species. So today I'm going to address the conservation status of common terns across inland North America. by first addressing what is known about their distribution and population trends, as well as their population demography and vital rates, and then exploring the factors that are contributing to these population trends, and finally wrapping up with some proposed solutions to support common tern conservation in this region. So this is a map of North America that shows the breeding distribution of common terns. After declines from the plume trade in the late 1800s and DDT and other pesticides in the mid 1900s, populations on the Atlantic coast increased until approximately 100,000 pairs of common terns and have remained relatively stable since about 2000. At the same time, however, the only well-studied population of common terns in inland North America, in the Great Lakes region indicated here, decreased from as much as 15,000 pairs in the 1960s to around 11,000 pairs in 1980, and then further to our current population estimate from the latest census in 2009 of about 9,000 pairs. So this constitutes a loss of about 5,000 pairs in 50 years. And because of this, common terns are protected under state endangered species legislation throughout the Great Lakes states. And in both the US and Canada, colonies are intensely monitored and management activities are constantly occurring. However, reliable trend data were not available for any other inland areas. And thus, in 2012, we undertook surveys in collaboration with Canadian Wildlife Service to understand what at the time was thought to be the largest stronghold for inland common terns in North America, the large Manitoba lakes. Survey data from the 1990s of this region had estimated a population size in the large Manitoba lakes of about 20,000 pairs of common terns. But when we arrived in 2012, we found an approximately 70% decline to about 8,000 pairs. A follow-up study just 5 years later in 2017 by McKellar et al. Found a further decline of almost 40% to about 5,000 pairs of common terns. This constitutes a loss of about 15,000 pairs of common terns in a 20-year period. And although these are the main areas that have been studied, estimates of population size for common terns across this entire region have used this data to extrapolate to an estimate of about 150,000 pairs of common terns within inland regions. However, the empirical data that we're seeing here, as well as data collected throughout the boreal areas, suggests that this population estimate is way higher than reality. So for example, in 2011 and 2012, Dave Moore and colleagues sampled 1/5 of boreal Ontario, and they came up with a population size of about 845 pairs. From that, they extrapolated to the entire Ontario boreal region and came up with an estimate of about 4,500 breeding pairs. Point estimates are spattered throughout other sites throughout this region. And these estimates focus on large lakes and areas that appear to have the best habitat for breeding common terns. And these suggest that the densities that are most likely in the boreal area are much closer to what we find with Moore et al., thus making the population estimates of entire inland North America being 150,000 seem very implausible. And simple extraction from the data that we do have puts that number at about 1/5 of this estimate. So somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 common terns in the inland North America region. So where does that leave us? First, estimates for terns in inland North America appear to be 1/5 of what was previously suggested. And second, the only two regions for which we have reliable trend data suggest that there are steep declines occurring. What if in the less studied areas, those steep declines are also happening? What does this mean for common terns? And to explore this idea further, we're going to look at some additional data. So the next question I'm going to address is what is known about population demography and vital rates across this region. I want to spend the next part of the talk discussing evidence that would help us to understand the declines that we see in the well-studied areas. In theory, changes in breeding populations can be attributed to vital rates. So I'm first going to consider immigration and emigration. And the information I'm going to provide is from the papers that are listed here. So we sampled blood from chicks at a range of sites between 2008 and 2012. And I want to give a shout out to everyone who helped collect those samples, some of which are here today. We analyzed these samples using 6 microsatellite markers and calculating movement with phase S and migrate N to determine how birds were moving between the regions over 2 periods. A contemporary period, which represents the time from 1990 until present forward, and an historical period, which represents a time period before 1960. So prior to 1960, there was very little exchange of birds between any of these regions. Movement from coastal populations to inland populations has remained at low levels even in contemporary times. However, there has been a 10-fold increase in movements away from Manitoba populations. And this might appear that this is what's driving the declines that we're seeing in Manitoba. However, this movement is dwarfed by a much larger influx of birds from Great Lakes regions into Manitoba. And what I want you to know here is that these movements are coupled with population declines in Manitoba. So birds aren't just moving, they're disappearing once they get to Manitoba. This movement away from the Great Lakes is also shown in movement to coastal colonies as well. Another interesting finding that I won't go into in much detail is that the genetic work demonstrates an increased movement within the regions as well. So within the Manitoba areas and within the Great Lakes areas in the contemporary time period, we have much more movement than we did in historical time period. So what about other aspects associated with vital rates? Well, let's have a quick look at natality, which we define as productivity or the number of chicks fledged per nest. So there were few data prior to 1990, but from 1990 to present, we were able to use the Appendix 2 from the Birds of North America to do a quick meta-analysis, which included 14 sites and 154 site years. And this analysis shows very low productivity across inland regions, much lower than our models predict are required to keep this population stable. Unfortunately, we have very little information on this fourth parameter. Although we are working on it, there are no recent survival estimates for inland populations. So that brings me to the third section of my talk. What factors seem to be driving the demographic rates and population trends that we are seeing? So what's going on in inland regions? Why is productivity low? Why is there this increased movement? As you can see from this image of Tommy Thompson Park, the city of Toronto acts as a stark reminder to the anthropogenic pressure that's on common tern population. Our specific results from Manitoba, which only includes 6 sites in a single year, still suggest some potentially alarming trends. What we show here is that distance from human settlement, is that the sites that are furthest from human settlement are those that are largest and also have the highest levels of productivity. So what's driving this anthropogenic pressure? And those of you that have worked with common terns in inland regions are going to be very aware of all of the pressures that I'm going to talk about. But first we have competition, both direct from development, but also indirectly by supporting populations of organisms like gulls that compete with common terns. Predation is a major impact, has major impact on colony failure, and many of the predators that prey on common terns are a result of changes in human land use and human occupation. And then finally, flooding causes colony loss and habitat reduction, both direct through regulation and land use and indirect through climate change. And if we need more evidence that human use changes might be driving trends for common terns, let's have a quick look at land use. Here I've imposed the range of the common tern on this land use map. I've also added some dots to indicate well-settled areas and those that are more sparsely settled or unsettled. And what you can see here is the complete overlap with the Great Lakes colony of those areas that have high levels of human settlement, and a partial overlap of the Manitoba colony. And the other thing to note here is that those colonies that are large and of high productivity in Manitoba are the ones that are located in this area that has sparse human populations rather than the more settled areas. So, so you might be thinking, okay, well, I'm going to move on to the next slide and change this a little bit. Sorry. So in summary, we have serious declines in the only 2 inland areas for which we have data. The genetics work suggests that birds are moving away from the Great Lakes to areas in Manitoba, which are also experiencing great declines. We know that there's low productivity throughout the region, and we have very little information on survival. And available evidence suggests that human impacts are the smoking gun for declines. So you might be thinking, well, all this is going to be okay because we have all these unsettled regions in the boreal, which are within the range of common terns, and so they can move there, and that can be the safe frontier for them. Unfortunately, these are the very areas where the most rapid land use changes are happening. So this is a graph, so this figure shows a change in land use in about a 5-year period from 2010 to 2015, and those purple dots indicate land use change. If we superimpose this on the figure that we've been looking at, what we can see is that land use changes that are happening, which are mostly a result of mining, logging, or other activities, fall exactly in those areas that form the last frontier for common terns. Here I have a picture of the Alberta tar sands, just to give a graphic example of what some of these land use changes look like. So we have major population declines, we have human activities implicated, and we have the boreal areas or the last frontier that is compromised. So this brings me to the last 2 slides of my talk, identifying conservation solutions. I hope that I have made compelling arguments as to why common terns need prioritization for research and conservation. But what are the solutions? Well, obviously, we need more surveys of the large unsurveyed boreal areas, and we need to repeat the surveys of the large lakes and continue to monitor the large inland populations. Monitoring should include more than just counting population numbers, but also measuring productivity and movement, which could be done through genetics or telemetry studies. Adult survival is a big unknown in this area, and if it is playing a role, we may already be much further down the line of losing the common tern in inland areas than we previously thought. Obviously, current colony-based management activities are essential, as colonies would have been lost even sooner without them. But we need to adapt this current local management into a regional framework to maximize the effectiveness for conservation of populations on a regional scale. And I know some people are already doing this, but we really need to amp up this regional scale approach. So what would this look like? Currently, management for common terns is focused on the symptoms, low productivity, for example, not the causes, the anthropogenic drivers we discussed. However, this is probably the case for almost all conservation issues. To address the drivers, we need to manage sites collectively rather than singly, as they obviously function as metapopulations as shown by our movement data. Work at existing locations should definitely continue, but we should also add strategically new locations. Regional management units should be identified because the issues that terns are facing within the different regions are likely to be slightly different. And finally, we need to recognize that this is not just a common tern issue. In this case, common terns are ecosystem sentinels, and anthropogenic degradation of freshwater ecosystems affects many species and ecosystems. And I will end with that, and I would like to thank all the people that contributed to the data that I presented here, as well as all those who have been working on common terns and their protection for the long haul. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Jen. That's a great addition to kind of what's known about common terns in this area. I see we already have a question in the chat. Jeff Spendelow. Is there enough banding being done at any of these inland colony sites to be able to estimate adult survival rates?
Great question, Jeff. So we do have a database at one of our long-term sites at Presqu'île Provincial Park that we're hoping we'll be able to elucidate some adult survival rates. There are very few sites where there is enough banding data and where it's been done in a way that allows a good marker capture study and marker capture analysis to be done. But we do have some of that data and we are going to try to do it. The one complication involved is that these birds are moving around and have larger metapopulation dynamics than we originally expected.
Some general questions. I don't see, or sorry, comments in the chat. I don't see other questions. Okay. If there are none, I guess certainly as questions occur, I know Jen will monitor the chat and we could address them there. But I guess we'll move forward. Our next talk stays in North America and stays focused on a species of particular conservation interest, whooping cranes, as you can see on the slide, and that'll be given to us today by Hillary Thompson. So Hillary, we see your slide really well. Take it away.
Sounds good, thank you. My name is Hillary Thompson. I work for the International Crane Foundation, and I'm going to talk today about the 20-year status of the Eastern migratory whooping crane reintroduction. I'd like to acknowledge that the International Crane Foundation headquarters is in Baraboo, Wisconsin, which is located within the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people. We acknowledge and honor the Ho-Chunk people as caretakers of the land and water since time immemorial and as our neighbors, friends, and vital members of our community. Here in North America, we have two species of cranes, the most common crane species in the world, the sandhill crane, as well as the most rare species of crane in the world, the whooping crane. Historically, whooping cranes were never as common as sandhill cranes. Their historic ranges in the map here in green. The whooping cranes are more wetland dependent species and less adaptable to upland habitats than sandhill cranes. So their distribution has been tied to those wetland habitats. The population was very low in size in the 1940s, down to about a dozen individuals that were migrating between Canada at Wood Buffalo National Park and Gulf Coastal Texas at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in the map here in gray. I'll refer to that as the wild population since that was the extent of the wild population prior to any reintroduction efforts. The whooping crane was listed as endangered, which ultimately led to the establishment of a captive breeding population, which produced whooping crane chicks to be released into the wild to establish different reintroduced populations. The population that I'll be focusing on today is the Eastern migratory population, which breeds in Wisconsin during the summer and was originally taught to migrate via following ultralight aircraft down to Gulf coastal Florida, and this reintroduction effort was started in 2001. I'd also like to mention quickly that this effort has been undertaken through a partnership of state, federal, and nonprofit agencies. And not all of this has been done by me, so thank you to the members of the Whooping Crane Eastern Partnership, the Wisconsin DNR Fish and Wildlife Service, and others that have really been working on this reintroduction since the beginning. To establish this population in an area where there historically were no longer whooping cranes, we've used a combination of rearing techniques, originally focused on using costume rearing so that whooping cranes were imprinting on something that looked like a whooping crane. The people in these crane costumes then would fly ultralight aircraft, and the cranes were taught to follow these aircraft on their original migration. Once the flyway was established and there were adult whooping cranes migrating between Wisconsin and Florida, costume rearing was still used to rear the cranes, but then they were released into the wild in Wisconsin, and they learned to migrate from adult whooping cranes. And most recently, we've used a technique called parent rearing, where adult whooping cranes in captivity serve as foster parents for captive reared chicks that are then released into the wild. And the hope with parent rearing is that whooping crane chicks in captivity are learning more natural behaviors by being raised by adult cranes rather than by people in crane costumes. Prior to release, all individuals are tagged with uniquely colored leg bands, as well as either VHF or GPS transmitters. We also capture and tag wild hatched whooping cranes. So nearly every individual in this population has been tagged. And that really allows us to do intensive long-term monitoring of individuals throughout their lifetime and gain a lot of information about the species and this population, as well as crane reintroductions in general. By doing this and by this long-term monitoring effort, we've been able to estimate population size through the course of this reintroduction. On the right-hand side, you can see the estimated population size, which is the black line on this graph. And then each year, the bars represent either cranes that were added into the population or that had been removed from the population through mortality or had gone missing over time. So in the early stages of this reintroduction, the population size was really growing. We were releasing 15 to 25 individuals in a year and really building that population in the wild. Between about 2010 and 2017, the population size kind of stabilized while the release cohorts were a little bit smaller and the Louisiana non-migratory population was being established. And in recent years, the population size has declined slightly down to about 80 individuals. And this has really been attributed to a decrease in the number of released individuals into the wild, partially due to a change in some of the captive breeding centers. And when the adult whooping cranes in captivity are moved to new breeding sites, they typically will experience a lag in reproductive success and fewer eggs laid and chicks reared in captivity for release into the wild. The natural reproduction, the light gray kind of angle line bars on here. We've had some wild fledged chicks in recent years that have been offsetting mortality to some extent, but is not enough to really see that population growth again. Over time, causes of mortality have remained pretty much the same. Yaw et al. Evaluated this last year and looked at causes of mortality in the first decade of the reintroduction compared to the most recent decade and found that the major sources of mortality really haven't changed. Predation remains the leading cause of mortality of adult birds in this population, which is kind of what we would expect to see. However, we've had two more human-induced causes of mortality that still are something that we can work to reduce in this population. 26% of confirmed mortalities were attributed to impact trauma, which typically is related to power line collisions. So the International Crane Foundation has been working with power line or power companies as they put up new power lines or working to mark existing power lines in areas where cranes may be migrating or lines that are close to wetlands that may be more of a threat to both sandhill cranes and whooping cranes to try to reduce mortality related to impact trauma. There have also been a number of mortalities from illegal gunshot in the flyway, and the Crane Foundation has an extensive outreach program focused in areas where there are whooping cranes that either breed or winter to try to reduce mortality from illegal gunshot. Historically, like I mentioned, this population was taught to migrate all the way down to Florida and spend the winter or the non-breeding season in Gulf coastal marshes in Florida. However, the population is no longer conducting that entire migration. Many birds are short stopping and spending the winter in southern Illinois, Indiana, as well as northern Alabama. In the map on the right, you can see that only one whooping crane actually went all the way down to Florida last winter. So we're seeing a pretty big shift in the both migration distance, but also in the habitat that whooping cranes are using on the wintering grounds. As you might imagine, southern Indiana doesn't quite look like Gulf coastal Florida, so whooping cranes are using many more agricultural areas on the wintering grounds, which also means they're using lots of private lands compared to protected marshes or refuges in Florida. This is definitely different from the winter habitat that the wild population is using in Gulf coastal Texas. So we're continuing to evaluate if this is affecting their reproductive success in any way, but also working with landowners and land managers on the wintering grounds to protect and manage whooping crane winter habitat. On the breeding grounds, cranes are exhibiting strong reproductive behaviors that we would like to see in the wild, including forming lasting pair bonds. Whooping cranes, like many other crane species, are known to mate for life, or at least, mostly mate for life. But we've had pairs in this population that have been together for over a decade and are exhibiting, unison calling and dancing and nesting behavior. They're building habitat or building nests in good nesting habitat, nests that aren't susceptible to flooding or to drying out. So that's positive, and they're also laying fertile eggs. However, whooping cranes are still experiencing some challenges in terms of reproduction, particularly related to widespread nest abandonments due to avian feeding black flies on the breeding grounds. This has mostly been seen at Necedah National Wildlife Refuge, and we have implemented a few tools to try to ameliorate the effects of black flies on nesting whooping cranes. One of the tools that we can use is called forced renesting, which means that we actually remove eggs from whooping crane nests as they're starting to be bothered by black flies. And this allows us to bring those eggs into captivity, where they're raised in captive environments and then released back into the wild later in the season. And we're able to collect many more eggs than if we were salvaging eggs from abandoned nests. We also have seen that whooping cranes that abandon their nest, typically only 42% of those pairs would re-nest again, lay another clutch of eggs later in the season. But if we collect eggs preemptively, that number increases to about 79% of pairs that will lay another clutch of eggs later in the season when black flies are less of an issue. So that's really helped us get whooping crane chicks to hatch. We've also started releasing whooping cranes into new areas in eastern Wisconsin where we've seen fewer black flies. And those pairs are just now starting to breed in those areas. So we're continuing to evaluate if they're having better hatching success than pairs at Necedah, where they're affected more so by black flies. However, we are still seeing low rates of productivity and low chick survival and fledging success in the population, even when we are getting chicks to hatch. So this has been the main focus of much of the research that's been ongoing in the population, to try to kind of get this last step for the population to be self-sustaining and not be relying on releases of captive reared individuals. Over time, the number of nesting pairs has either grown or stabilized at around 20 to 25 pairs. That's actually in line with our goal in the whooping crane recovery plan, is to have a population of about 100 individuals with about 20 to 25 breeding pairs. So we're there in that respect, but we still would like to see more chicks fledge in a year to offset natural mortality, and like I said, not rely on the releases of captive reared individuals. So we have had that yellow line on the bottom. We have had some chicks fledge in each year for the past 7 or so years, but we definitely would like to see that number increase. So what are the reasons why that might be happening? Many of the hypotheses kind of fall into these two categories, where maybe there's some aspect of behavior or captive rearing that's affecting whooping cranes' ability to raise their chicks, or maybe it's some aspect of their breeding habitat that's not giving them the tools that they need to raise their chicks to fledging for their chicks to recruit into the population. So for the behavioral side, one way to try to reduce any impact of captive rearing or of costume rearing on parenting abilities or reproductive success is that parent rearing, like we had talked about earlier, where cranes are being raised by other cranes in captivity. So hopefully they're learning behaviors from those captive parents that maybe they weren't getting from people in costumes. And we'll continue to evaluate if rearing technique, either parent rearing or being reared by actual parents in the wild, has improved reproductive success as the population grows. We also started looking at cause-specific mortality for whooping crane chicks. This was a graduate student project done by Casey Stewart from UW Oshkosh, looking at sandhill and whooping crane chicks at Necedah National Wildlife Refuge and trying to identify what were the causes of mortality for those chicks. For the ones that she was able to identify a cause of death, the majority of them were predated by a wide variety of predators. Some were victim to exposure or disease, but by and large, most of the crane chicks that she recovered, she was not able to tell a cause of death. This is mostly due to the difficulty of tracking crane chicks in the marsh in the summertime. They're not very visible, and also even if you do recover carcasses quickly, things are either scavenged or degraded enough to make it difficult to determine cause-specific mortality. So because of that, we have tried to focus on this issue from more indirect ways, looking at other factors kind of that could be impacting these chicks throughout their life. One thing that we found is that behavior and parenting behavior experience does seem to matter. So chicks that fledged tended to have older parents that had more years of nesting experience. And older adult females were more likely to have their chicks reach 40 days old, which is one of the benchmarks that we've seen, that once they make it past that point, they're a lot more likely to make it to fledging. So this is good news for whooping cranes, that you know, we really just need to keep adults on the landscape and give them enough time to gain that experience on their own, and they're able to learn and get experience, and hopefully we'll continue to see fledging success increase into the future. We've also been doing some nesting habitat studies, particularly comparing whooping cranes to sandhill cranes who nest in some of the same marshes, to see if there's any difference between the two species. If there was a difference, then potentially there could be something related to the whooping crane's behavior, but also it could be just differences in nesting habitat requirements between the two species. We have seen pretty similar hatching success for the two species in the same breeding areas during this study, but we still have seen some pretty different rates of fledging for their colts. So overall, whooping crane chicks that we monitored in this year, 16% of them fledged, whereas 33% of the sandhill crane colts fledged. However, there was a lot of variability between sites for sandhill cranes, so there may still be some habitat factors that are affecting fledging rates that we have yet to examine. Some of the other habitat work that we've been doing with graduate students in Wisconsin include looking at growing season drawdowns at Necedah, and UW Stevens Point graduate student Ross McLean found that drawdowns at Necedah were promoting crane colt survival. So cranes were moving into areas where there were drawdowns, and their colts were surviving for longer if they were in those areas. So this is one management tool that's being used at the refuge to help crane colts that are breeding there, or cranes that are breeding there, have their colts survive for longer. So that is being implemented yearly at Necedah, and we've seen some increases in whooping crane colt survival there as well. We're also looking at some of the differences in breeding habitat between Necedah and some of our newer release areas, where cranes are subject to more upland and agricultural areas than they are at Necedah. So we're continuing to monitor that and examine those habitat factors going forward to see if the new release sites are comparable to the habitat that cranes are using at Necedah, or if there's ways that we can manage habitat differently in different sites to promote whooping crane colt success. And lastly, our graduate student Nikki Gordon at UW-Madison is looking at populations of potential predators of crane colts in the different breeding areas to see if different whooping crane families are experiencing different threat levels related to predator populations or habitat preferences of predators within or near their breeding sites. So trying to, find different ways to kind of come at this issue from different angles to address fledgling success in this population. We are definitely making progress. We have many more whooping cranes in the world than we did historically. So definitely up from that 14 individuals in the 1940s. And we're learning a lot more about whooping cranes in general, whooping cranes in this more developed and agricultural landscape, reintroduction efforts as a whole, reintroductions even of other crane species, but also ways that we can help promote the success of whooping cranes in this population. And with that, I would take any questions.
Hillary, thanks so much for that update on a truly amazing conservation effort. I will point you to a question, a request in the chat about the possible use of one of your slides. But we have a question from Jeff Costa. Does forced renesting impact nest site fidelity in whooping cranes? Do they rest in the same location in the same year or even subsequent years?
We have not seen any impact on nest site fidelity related to forced renesting. Whooping cranes are highly territorial. They don't reuse the exact same nest, but they'll often renest in very similar areas, even within the same year or in subsequent years. Yeah.
Great. Another question, has the loss of the crane breeding program at Patuxent had a major impact on whooping crane restoration, or have other facilities been able to compensate for that loss? Have the birds that were moved from Patuxent are they still producing chicks?
Yeah, it's definitely had an impact in terms of the numbers of chicks that we've been able to release, or chicks that were raised in captivity, because like I mentioned, once the cranes were moved from Patuxent to the new breeding centers, they've been experiencing a lag in reproduction. So some of those pairs haven't started laying eggs again, or haven't been laying as many eggs as they maybe did at Patuxent. But I think that was kind of a known potential thing that might happen, because when they experience something stressful, they're less likely to be ready to reproduce. But I think we're still hopeful that those pairs will come back online this coming year and be able to produce more chicks that we can release into the wild. We also had a lag in captive rearing because of the pandemic as well, just making it difficult for captive breeding centers to be able to raise chicks. So hopefully that won't be as much of an issue in the coming years.
Right, yeah, that pandemic impacted so much in the way of conservation. I think that's all the questions I see, and we'll go ahead and move on, but thank you very much, Hillary. Our next talk moves across to Western North America and focuses on another large white bird, that be the American white pelican. And Amy Van Totenhove will look at, or is looking at, long-term drivers of population dynamics in this species. Amy, we see your slide well, so take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks for the intro, Don. There have been some really neat talks so far, so this has been a fun session to be a part of. So I'm Amy Van Totenhove, a PhD candidate at Utah State University, co-advised by Drs. Clark Freshing and Erica Stuber. So today I'll be talking about analyses from one of my dissertation chapters, Local versus Broad-Scale Population Drivers, a Bayesian state space analysis of long-term American white pelican colony dynamics. Let's see. Okay, so I'll start out here by giving you a quick and general overview of what I'll talk about today to keep you oriented. And I'll begin by introducing our study system and population drivers of interest, then move to methods and results and their implications, and talk about a population viability analysis we're working on conducting with the results from our analysis. So we focus on the American white pelican breeding colony on Gunnison Island, Utah, which is located in the northern arm of Great Salt Lake. And it's a really unique colony as it's surrounded by hypersaline water and is also one of the largest American white pelican breeding colonies in the Western United States. So American white pelicans are a conservation priority species for both the state of Utah and a number of other states within the greater Western region. And this is due to pelican sensitivity to disturbance during the breeding season and their concentration at a few discrete breeding locations. And the Gunnison colony itself is important in a number of ways as well. So white pelicans are thought to be split along the continental divide into two metapopulations, an eastern and a western metapopulation. And the Gunnison colony, being one of the largest colonies in the Western US, depending on the year, is thought to contribute significantly to the Western metapopulation of white pelicans. And it's also the only permanent breeding colony of white pelicans. Wonderfully long-term colony count data set from Gunnison Island, collected by the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, with counts going back as far as 1963 and regular counts starting in the 1980s. And you can see that there's this huge amount of variation in colony abundance from year to year. And it looks like there's a downward trend after that initial population boom in the mid-1980s. So it's a really interesting data set from a population dynamics perspective. So what's driving this huge population variability? Are we seeing the effects of local Great Salt Lake specific environmental variables that are directly affecting the Gunnison population, or are these fluctuations part of what could be a larger environmental picture, potentially affecting the entire Western metapopulation? And depending on whether these drivers are local or broad scale, can we actually tease their effects apart? So let's step back a minute and talk about why distinguishing between local and broad scale drivers is actually important. So if both broad scale and local drivers have the potential to influence demographic rates and therefore population dynamics within the Gunnison colony, why do we care what category they fall into, local or broad scale? Well, first of all, knowing the source of population fluctuations can give us a better understanding of the demographic processes underlying these fluctuations, and it allows us to more accurately model populations based on changing environmental conditions. And also from a more practical standpoint, understanding the spatial scale of population drivers allows managers to figure out what they can feasibly do to manage the population at a local level, like here in Utah, and when they need to pull in partners from a broader spatial scale, like the entire Pacific or mountain flyways. So I know we're all waterbird people here, but a good real world example of the importance of distinguishing between local and broad scale drivers is the black-throated blue warbler from a really neat study by Townsend et al. In 2016. And this study explored the effects of enzo on survival and fecundity of black-throated blue warblers. And essentially the gist of this research is that broad-scale drivers can have measurable effects on populations, and they may affect different life processes at different times of the year compared to local drivers. So potentially very important to a population. So with that in mind, let's explore the drivers that we selected for this analysis. So our primary drivers of interest were environmental, and the Great Salt Lake is this oasis in a relatively arid landscape, and it supports millions of breeding or migrating birds each year, which are likely affected by how much water is available in Great Salt Lake. So our first driver of interest was Great Salt Lake water levels. Unfortunately for pelicans and other birds using Great Salt Lake, Utah is experiencing a massive drought, which is technically known as a mega drought, which has lasted more than 2 decades. And we've seen this reflected in Great Salt Lake water levels. So these photos show a striking example of the water level decline in Great Salt Lake. So the picture here on the left is an image of some buildings in Great Salt Lake in 1986 during this massive multi-year flooding event where buildings were swamped completely by rising floodwaters, and the state actually had to build some giant pumps out on the west side of Great Salt Lake to pump water out of the area. And then the picture here on the right is a photo I took earlier this year, and this is in the same area where the water is about ankle deep in this photo. I think I took it in June, and in the months following, it dried out completely. So looking back at our table, you'll notice I have a plus and minus listed for the predicted relationship of water levels and Gunnison population. So we can expect if water levels are directly affecting the amount of nesting habitat at the colony by submerging or uncovering areas on Gunnison Island, that you'd see a negative relationship between water levels and colony abundance. However, we would expect to see a positive relationship between water levels and abundance if the limiting factor is foraging area for pelicans around Great Salt Lake. So a little bit of background, the lake itself is devoid of fish, and pelicans can only feed in the brackish wetlands, which are shallow and subject to really drastic changes in area and therefore food availability, even with small water level fluctuations of Great Salt Lake. Then moving on, we also explored the presence of a land bridge connecting Gunnison Island to the shore in low water level years. So Gunnison Island is located in a shallow part of Great Salt Lake. And back in the 1980s, with those super high water levels, it was a distinct island, as you can see here in that top left picture. But with a recent drought, the land bridge has been exposed, which you can see in that bottom left picture. And using camera traps on the island, collaborators have captured evidence of terrestrial, which we suspect are impacting other bird breeding populations there. Okay, so we also explored another local driver, minimum spring temperature, which we expected to have a quadratic relationship with pelican abundance, with extreme high or low temperatures negatively affecting pelican abundance via low recruitment, considering pelican chicks are sensitive to temperature extremes. So essentially, we know that springs are getting warmer in Utah, which may be good for pelican recruitment initially, but as springs get warmer, the temperature may reach a threshold that exceeds their physiological tolerances, especially in an already warm state like Utah. Okay, so moving on to broad scale drivers. A broad scale driver we looked at was the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or PDO, which is this pattern of atmospheric and oceanic climate variation over the Pacific that drives temperature and precipitation regionally on a semi-decadal to decadal scale. So the PDO is measured in positive and negative phases, with warmer, drier weather in negative phases and cold, wet weather in positive phases in Utah. So assuming warmer, drier springs are more optimal for pelican recruitment at this point, we predicted a negative relationship between PDO and colony abundance. And we know PDO has a strong effect on colonial seabirds on the West Coast and passerines in the Caribbean, like the black-throated blue warbler I mentioned earlier. So considering its effects are felt across the continent, inland species may feel its effects as well. And we have evidence from analyses using tree ring data from Utah that PDO influences tree growth in the region. And so it seems reasonable to assume this would influence pelicans as well. Then we also looked at the Southern Oscillation Index, or SOI. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with El Nino and La Nina, and SOI measures the atmospheric component of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which, much like PDO, is this multi-year ocean temperature anomaly in the Pacific that drives regional precipitation and temperatures. So Utah is situated in what's considered a relatively neutral zone for SOI. So the effects of SOI may vary with the strength of oscillation. But in general, positive indices usually indicate warmer, drier weather in Utah. So we expected colony abundance to be positively correlated with SOI. And finally, we used breeding colony abundance as a proxy for density dependence, which we predicted would have a negative relationship with colony abundance because with limited nesting habitat on Gunnison Island, there's an upper bound to how many pelicans can successfully find nesting habitat on the colony. Okay, so in addition to looking at within-year drivers of colony counts, we looked for potential lagged effects of environmental drivers where conditions on the breeding grounds might influence the number of breeding adults in future years. So pelicans are thought to move between colonies and may avoid locations they previously deemed poor. And as along with birds, pelicans may also opt not to breed in years with poor conditions. And to explore potential full annual cycle lags, we looked at a time lag of 1 year for all of our covariates. Then we also explored longer time lags to find any potential signal of natal colony fidelity and to reflect recruitment success. So while anecdotally, it seems like pelicans move between colonies, we don't know how readily they move at this point. And any correlation between hatchery abundance and abundance when pelicans are thought to first begin breeding may actually indicate colony fidelity. And because white pelicans take 3 or 4 years, we think to reach sexual maturity, we also tested 3 and 4 year time lags for all of our covariates. Okay, so for this analysis, we used a Bayesian state space model implemented in R with Nimble. And state-based models are neat because they allow us to model true abundance, which you can see in the figure here in orange, from raw observation data, which are in the dark gray. And wildlife counts, especially those of this magnitude, are subject to over or under counting. So by modeling the true abundance from our raw data, we can actually separate any annual variability in true abundance from noise associated with imperfect counts. So then we filtered the data to 1987 and later, which eliminates that exponential growth dynamic within which we might not be able to detect the effects of environmental drivers that we're interested in looking at. So we scaled and centered our data and then fit a model for each predictor with same year effects and for time lags for 1, 3, and 4 years, like I mentioned before, and then selected only the potentially important predictors, or those with an 80% credible interval, not overlapping 0. Then with those important predictors, we fitted a global model. And the effect of simplifying our workflow, so we didn't have to fit a single model with predictor in every single time lag, and that also minimized potential convergence issues. So here we have our estimates from our global model. So starting with water levels, we found that there was a positive relationship between Great Salt Lake water levels and colony counts with a time lag of 1 year. So this indicates that pelicans at the breeding colony are sensitive to water levels on the foraging grounds, where more water equals more foraging area, and not at the colony, where high water levels might limit nesting habitat. And this 1 year time lag suggests that water levels may influence an adult pelican's decision to breed on Gunnison Island the next year, either by influencing individuals to seek out other colonies with more abundant food in years with low water at Great Salt Lake, or by pushing pelicans to forego breeding completely the next year due to potentially poor body condition as a result of reduced food availability in Great Salt Lake wetlands. Then looking at land bridge presence. Land bridge presence was negatively correlated with colony abundance with a 4 year time lag, suggesting that terrestrial predators accessing the island via the land bridge may negatively impact pelican recruitment, as fewer pelicans fledging in a given year would result in fewer pelicans returning to breed at the colony for the first time once they reach sexual maturity 4 years down the line. And this also suggests that there is some degree of measurable colony fidelity for first-time breeders back to their natal colony or Gunnison Island. Then minimum spring temperature and colony abundance had a positive relationship with In accordance with our predictions, our mean estimate for temperature squared was negative, which I'd like to think indicates that there's a quadratic effect of temperature on colony abundance. But of course, the credible intervals for this estimate overlap 0. Interestingly, temperature was the only covariate that didn't show any evidence of lagged effects on colony abundance, indicating that adult pelicans may actually be using temperature as a deciding factor for whether to initiate breeding, or may be abandoning or losing their young in years with poor temperatures for breeding. And then finally, breeding colony abundance appeared to have a strong negative effect on the next year's colony count, suggesting some effect of density dependence at the colony or in the greater region. So key takeaways from this analysis. First of all, we didn't detect any effects of broad-scale drivers on the population. As you saw in that table that I just showed, none of those important predictors were broad-scale. And this may be in part due to Utah being situated in a relatively neutral zone for SOI, like I mentioned previously. But the lack of measurable effect from PDO was surprising. So one possibility is that while this is a long-term data set, we have the data set for this analysis, and we may just simply not have enough statistical power to detect those broad-scale effects. Second, the effects of colony abundance suggest strong density dependence. So going back to your population modeling 101 class, you'll remember that negative density dependence reduces the incidence of population extinction or extreme growth. So in theory, negative density dependence at the Gunnison colony should modulate future population fluctuations to a degree. We also found that, interestingly, local water levels and temperature worked against each other, where we have water levels decreasing, driving colony numbers down, and spring temperatures increasing, which should drive numbers up at least to a point. However, with our model estimating land bridge presence as having a negative relationship with future colony abundance, the land bridge's current existence spells potential trouble for the Gunnison pelican population in the future, and potentially the Western metapopulation. So speaking of future population, if you'll remember back to my outline, I mentioned that we used our global model to conduct a population viability analysis of the Gunnison pelican population with a goal of advising state and wildlife managers on potential future colony dynamics and to explore management options. So to run this PVA, we used our global model's beta estimates and projections of our environmental covariates to forecast populations out to 2040 and generate uncertainty around these estimates. And in addition to just using predicted environmental covariates, we also explored future population dynamics under a handful of additional climate scenarios, one of which I'll detail in this talk, by systematically holding one or more of our environmental covariates constant at their mean values while using predicted future values for others. So for our first scenario, we produced population estimates using predicted values of water levels, land bridge presence, and temperature. Expect to happen if things continue at the rate they currently are. So in the scenario, density dependence appears to modulate population, protecting it from large declines. And this is really good news for us working to protect this population, but you can see here that the pelican population is still expected to continue to decline over time. And I'll caveat this with the fact that our model is a bit simplistic and doesn't necessarily take into account immigration or emigration, nor does it take into account the potential for increased numbers of predators accessing the island via land bridge as time goes on. Also, with the severity of the drought in the American West and more water being pulled from Great Salt Lake tributaries for agriculture as Utah's human population grows, the pelican population may decline at a faster rate than predicted, even with that buffering from extinction by density dependence. So essentially, while the population isn't forecast to decline to extinction in the next 20 or so years, we don't expect to see the population to increase. And unfortunately, from a management standpoint at a state level, not a whole lot can be done to quickly increase water levels of a large lake like Great Salt Lake, or to slow temperature increases across the state. However, of the environmental predictors we tested, land bridge presence is the one that we do have some control over, perhaps through fencing off or dredging around the colony. So with that in mind, we also explored a scenario where water levels continue to decline and temperature increases as expected, but the land bridge is removed. So looking over the figure on the right, you can see that our PVA predicts the pelican population on Gunnison to increase significantly with the removal of the land bridge. And while this PVA is still preliminary and density dependence still seems to have a strong effect on our estimates, our results suggest that removing access for terrestrial predators on the land to the land bridge may be a viable option to create stable nesting habitat and slower reverse the decline in colony abundance. So in the future, we hope to expand this population viability analysis and to work with Great Salt Lake managers to explore viable options to reduce Gunnison white pelican population declines within this framework. So with that, I'd like to thank my excellent collaborators on this analysis, including those who spent many, many years collecting data and making this long-term data set a reality. And I'd also like to thank my mom, who spent hours chasing pelicans around Colorado and taking incredible photos for me to use in presentations like this one. So with that, I'll take any questions you have.
Well, thanks very much, Amy. We have time for one relatively quick question. Well, Amy, I would just jump in. What's the prey base in the wetlands around the lake? Is that a lot of exotic species, carp, other warm water species that have been introduced, or are there some native species also?
There are some native species, but it is primarily carp. I mean, pelicans will eat anything they can get their bills on, but carp are their main focus, and we also have channel catfish. They eat a lot.
So probably species that will persist if water persists in those wetlands. Yeah.
Yes. And I know a lot of managers spend time trying to remove the carp, and they've still persisted quite well throughout the area. So they'll be here for a while.
Yeah. Maybe another quick one from Juliet. Any observations of specific mechanisms for the density dependent control?
Sure. So I think, granted, we've been putting GPS transmitters on these pelicans and seeing where they hang out, and it seems like a lot of it does have to do with that wetland size. So they're really, really dependent on these wetlands around Great Salt Lake to forage. And with such a large population, or they're also, they require really specific water levels to feed in. So they're dabblers. And so if the water's too shallow, they can't feed. And if the water's too deep, they also can't feed. A lot of it has to do, I think, with that wetland availability and with that huge population of pelicans here around Great Salt Lake. They're really competing for those foraging areas.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Amy. We'll now move into the last talk of the session. We'll move back across North America, more towards the American Great Lakes. Dave Moore is going to talk to us about ring-billed gulls and some neat investigation into what's typically understudied species, but very maybe in part because they're so abundant and familiar. Dave, we see your slide really well, so take it away. Dave, I'm not hearing you.
That's because after all this time, I still haven't gotten used to these Zoom meetings. Anyway, thanks, Don. And I just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to present some of our preliminary results on these egg removal experiments we've been doing, and specifically looking at persistence of the birds at these sites, the re-nesting probabilities, and the effects of management on movement patterns. And then I'd just like to acknowledge my two co-authors who are both attending the conference this year, Jeff Costa and Lindsay Colin. So the basic issue here in Ontario, where we live and work, there's been a fourfold increase in permits issued since the 1990s that deal with human gull conflicts. And if you look, like 250 permits per year might not seem like a lot, but individually, each of these permits is representative of hundreds or often thousands of breeding pairs of ring-billed gulls. And the conflicts are primarily occurring in urban areas, and routinely the conflict is the birds nesting on rooftops or in other brownfield situations where development is going on. So an obvious question is why is this increase in human gull conflicts occurring? If you look at this slide, it shows long-term dedicated waterbird monitoring, and the results from that are that there's actually been a 30% decline in the breeding or the ring-billed gull population over that same period where conflicts have been increasing. If you look at the roadside North American breeding bird survey results, it shows a pretty steady increase in relative abundance of gulls. So reconciling the different things that these studies or monitoring programs are telling us, I think the interpretation is that there's been a pretty wide scale shift of these gulls from nesting in more natural areas like islands throughout the Great Lakes to shifting to urban habitats. And this has been going on. It's a pretty cosmopolitan trend across most of the Northern Hemisphere. So in 2019, we initiated a research program to investigate this problem. And basically what we're doing falls into two main areas. On the left here, you have, we're asking questions about how these birds are adapting to urban landscapes, looking at breeding ecology, demography, post-breeding dispersal, and migration and migratory connectivity. And Jeff and I have presented the results of some of this work at previous Waterbird Society meetings. Sort of the other hat that we have, because I work for the Canadian Wildlife Service, and there's a big emphasis on the regulatory side of this issue. It's trying to look at how we can mitigate these conflicts between humans and gulls. Specifically, it's trying to quantify how the birds are using these urban habitats, assessing the efficacy of current approaches, management approaches, and then things like modeling the cumulative of effects of these local management actions and what's being taken in terms of eggs or adults, modeling it up to the level of population level effects. And ultimately, we're trying to provide evidence-based, develop evidence-based policy and best practices. In North America, we have the Migratory Birds Treaty between Canada, the US, and Mexico. And in Canada, the legislative framework for that is the Migratory Birds Convention Act. So the act recognizes and makes provisions for human-bird conflicts through these things called damage or danger permits that have very specific conditions. They're issued to, they're specific to landowner properties, and there has to be some attestation by the landowner that serious damage to property is occurring, or that these birds represent a serious danger to human health or safety. And specifically, part of this this type of permit, management for the purposes of population control is not authorized. So if you're dealing with serious danger or damage, there should be an emphasis on mitigating that damage or danger as quickly and aggressively as possible. So there's some nuances, but the approaches, the management approaches, can be broadly categorized in these 4 groups. You have habitat modification that makes the site unattractive to the birds, so we promote that as the first. These are hierarchical going down the list. Scaring, which is most effective if it's done before the birds actually establish territories at the site. And then there's a variety of nest destruction things that can be applied, including egg removal, oiling, or removal of nests. And finally, culling is only authorized in very exceptional cases. And I just want to point out the egg removal part's in bold because that's often the go-to for people that are practicing the management on these sites. So all of these methods their efficacy has been largely unassessed, either alone or in combination. So that's one of the objectives that we're trying to accomplish. And these arrows on the left-hand side, like you can imagine, in terms of long-term mitigation of the conflict, the ones at the top of the list are best, but coincidentally, they're also best for the birds. But from the landowner's perspective, and often the management is done through professional pest management companies, the things that we would like them to do and the hierarchy we would like them to approach the problem with is often the most costly things. The things that are most effective are actually the most costly. So it leads to this conflict over what the optimum approach is to solving these human gull conflicts. Okay, the work we're doing, just for reference, it's in Southern Ontario in Canada. The site we're working at is at the eastern and or western end of Lake Ontario, and it's a large port, heavily industrialized, and for Canada, a very dense population base. Specifically, we're working at one of these port facilities, and it's being developed. So over the last number of years, they've actually sectioned it off. So there's an area of the port in orange here that is under management, and we've worked with the landowner under their danger damage permit to do our work. But there's also a section of that area that's set aside for nesting colonial water birds. And at this site, it includes cormorants, ring-billed and herring gulls, and black-crowned night herons. And which I'll talk about in a second. These are where our study plots are set up. 2 on the managed part of the property and 1 on the unmanaged. I'm not going to talk very much about the methods we use for data collection. Basically tracking. Mostly we're deploying GPS pinpoint tags. Most of them are Ornitella. And then using the movement data we collect to plot on various land use products to get an idea of habitat use. And then using sort of standard mark recapture methods where we deploy field readable color bands and do resightings at a 2 to 3 day interval. Okay, this is a schematic of our experimental design. So we had those three study plots as I was referring to, and within each plot, birds are assigned to either getting a field readable color band and a backpack GPS transmitter, or the birds are assigned, nests are assigned to one of the adults receiving a field readable band. So we have our unmanaged control site. And then these 2 experimental egg removal plots. We have a plot where eggs were removed at around 4 to 5 days post clutch completion, and another plot where they were removed at about 12 or 13 days post completion. And the idea here is that ring-billed gulls are supposed to have about a 10-day egg-laying refractory period. So we thought that birds that are managed later in the phenology might be less likely to re-nest or more likely to abandon the colony. And then the sample sizes for each of these plots and groups are presented in the body of the table. Okay, the first couple slides, I'm going to be talking specifically about the effects of timing of egg removal on various things, and specifically comparing early egg removal, which is the black bars, and later egg removal, which is the orange bars. And looking at two things, local renesting of birds at the site on the left, and looking at renesting of all birds, which includes birds nesting at the site and birds nesting off-site, as inferred by the tags. So we found a really no or really weak effect of management timing on the likelihood of renesting. So you can see the later birds tended to be, or later egg removal tended to result in less renesting by these birds, but non-significant. And again, this slide looks at time to initiate a second clutch after egg removal. And again, it's in the predicted direction, where later nesting birds tended to be take longer to initiate their second clutch, but really it's not significant. And so there's a weak or no effective timing on the removal to relay the second clutch. This slide looks at colony attendance using our marks, our color banded birds, and basically just looking at control and all managed nests with the timing of early and mid incubation egg removal for reference at the bottom. The main results here is that yes, egg removal did reduce attendance of those birds by about 35%. But another point is that those birds are still remaining at the colony in fairly large numbers. So looking at renesting, comparing the 2 years, 2019 and 2021. And black is birds that nested within their original territory, and gray is birds that nested in the same colony but at a different location. So no difference between years and the probability of renesting. And if we add those birds that nested off-site, you can see that one of the main takeaways here is that a large proportion of these managed birds are renesting. About 70% of them renest within the season post-management. So where were these birds renesting? The inset map shows, like I said, most of the birds are renesting on the original territory. Others are spreading out throughout the study site. And then we get all these birds that are nesting at other sites within about a 50-kilometer radius of the original colony. And this one in green, it's just to remind me that that's the only colony site that is actually protected. All these other ones around the edge of Lake Ontario are they're nesting on malls or brownfields where you know, that they're creating a conflict. So in some respects, management at the one site is pushing these birds off and just spreading the conflict to other sites. So this slide looks at so renest, everything before it was renesting within the year, and this is looking at the effects of egg removal and renesting probability among years. So again, control nests are in black, and sort of the main point here is that these birds are highly site faithful. So we're getting about 85% fidelity renesting from one year to another. And not only are they coming back to the same site, but they're in many cases coming back within a meter and a half of their original territory from the preceding year. And the orange are birds that were managed. So in terms of resightings and confirmed nesting of these birds, slightly lower. There was a weak effect of preventing the birds from returning to the nest. But again, about 65% of these birds overall are returning the following year to nest, even though they were managed the year before. And to end, I just want to look at some movement patterns. I'm going to present 2 slides, and they're kind of representative of what the birds did in general. And one thing to point out is that the bottom panel, the scale is much bigger than it is for the top panel. So basically, you know, the week before management, this particular bird is shuttling back and forth between the colony and foraging sites in agricultural areas, and basically shuttling back and forth. Once management occurs, the home range expands dramatically and a lot more of a meandering pattern. But the main point here is that the bird's returning to the colony on a fairly regular basis, even though it doesn't have a nest there. So the second example, again, it's one of the 2 patterns we saw. So prior to management, the colony's here. This one's foraging in aquatic habitats, but you know, shuttling back and forth to the colony. It's typical central place foraging. And post management, the bird goes on this long meandering path with some, but again, returning to the colony, the original breeding colony periodically. So in general, post-management, all birds expanded their home range. Most birds either loafed at the colony or made return trips to the original colony. And some birds we saw went on these long prospecting trips that included other ring-billed gull colony sites. So in conclusion, egg removal reduced the number of breeding pairs attending the colony by about 35%. 60% of pairs renested at the original site within a season, and 16 pairs of these managed birds renested at other sites that were likely to cause conflicts. And timing did not have a strong effect on timing of egg removal, did not have a strong effect on the probability of renesting. So in isolation, egg removal is not a very effective management approach for resolving these human gull conflicts when your objective is to disperse the birds from the site as quickly as possible. And like many other people, COVID really threw a wrench in this work. We began in 2019, almost no field work in 2020, and very late last minute start in 2021. So we weren't able to do a lot of the treatments that we had hoped, but that will going forward, we're going to be looking more at scaring and combination of scaring and egg removal. But I think this is really valuable from a management perspective or from a regulatory perspective, because we can use some of this information to kind of push or leverage the things that we want, the methods that we want to promote that are best for the interests of the birds being managed. So with that, I just want to acknowledge that this work was conducted on the traditional lands of a number of First Nations, and all work was conducted under the required permits and animal care approvals. And then I just wanted to thank a number of people and organizations that helped with planning, logistics, and field work. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dave. We are a little over time. We can take questions, but I just wanted to mention a couple points that have been thrown into the chat. We're going to break for the lunch hour plus here shortly. And I would direct you all to check out the merchandise for the meeting, the silent auction, and the quilt raffle, and links to all of those things are in the chat currently. I would also like to plug the business meeting and committee meeting session this afternoon, followed by the awards ceremony, and notably the conservation paper award presentation during that session. So with that, I see we have at least one question in the chat. Dave, do you think it would make a difference in local renesting efforts if instead of removing the clutch, you left smashed eggs in the nest, with the acknowledgement that getting a permit to destroy eggs is perhaps more problematic?
Well, you're essentially destroying the eggs by removing them. But it might work, but I think like seeing a lot of the birds, like they do nest at their original territory, but I think the opportunity for them to just build a meter away or move somewhere else in that within that site, like I don't think smashing the eggs would make that much of a difference over removing them.
Another question, what type of scaring or hazing are you going to examine?
That one's a lot more nuanced and difficult to approach. Like it's more around the time, like I think keeping a consistent method and looking at timing. Like people, you know, the birds become habituated to scaring. If you do it early, it's much more effective. Like other places, they actually use raptors to scare the birds. And after they establish territories, like you can have a raptor perched in the middle of a colony and you have like a 10-meter halo around it. And it's birds nesting outside of that halo. So I think the timing is the most critical aspect of it. And so we're going to be trying to figure out how to approach it and what metrics we're going to measure, and then just using the same method at different time periods.
Dave, I would follow up. Have you considered canines, dogs?
Yeah, that's another thing that they've been doing.
Yeah, I think that halo effect is definitely common. I mean, it's common for ring-billed gulls even around people. I think you had a photo of someone in front of a spotting scope with just a ring of birds
Oh,
around
yeah.
them. Yeah, but my experience is that mammals, particularly mobile species like canids, are more effective.
Yeah, no, that's one thing we've been considering.
Yeah. I don't see any other questions. We certainly can take more questions, but if there aren't any, I would again encourage all to check out the merchandise options. I think it's a good opportunity to acquire Christmas gifts without the supply chain problems that you may experience elsewhere. And certainly, we hope that as many folks as possible will stay engaged with the meeting this afternoon and participate in the business of the meeting, and particularly the awards towards the end of the afternoon. So I'd like to thank all of the speakers today before we break, and also my moderation partner, David Kerstetter, who's been a big help behind the scenes.
Thanks, Don. My pleasure.
All right. Well, enjoy lunch. And I'm sure I'll see many of you this afternoon after we reconvene.
Thanks.